For Søren Kierkegaard, suffering is not an unfortunate side effect of faith. It is one of its defining conditions. Any account of Christianity that treats suffering as accidental, temporary, or merely psychological has already misunderstood what faith demands. This claim immediately collides with modern assumptions. We tend to think of suffering as something to be eliminated, explained, or overcome. If belief is true, we expect it to reduce suffering. If faith is meaningful, we expect it to provide comfort. Kierkegaard insists that this expectation reverses the structure of Christianity. Authentic faith does not remove suffering, it deepens it. This does not mean that suffering is good in itself. Kierkegaard is not romanticizing pain or glorifying misery. His claim is more precise and more disturbing. Suffering becomes unavoidable once faith is taken seriously, because faith places the individual in tension with the world, with others, and with themselves. Christianity, for Kierkegaard, demands inwardness. It demands that the individual relate to God as an individual, not as a member of a crowd or a bearer of an identity. This inwardness immediately isolates the believer. The individual cannot appeal to social norms, collective agreement, or institutional authority to justify their faith. They must live it personally. This personal commitment produces suffering, not because the world necessarily persecutes the believer, but because inward commitment places the individual at odds with the logic of ordinary life. Ordinary life seeks reassurance, recognition, and shared meaning. Faith refuses all three. Kierkegaard insists that suffering arises at this point of refusal. The believer does not suffer because God demands pain. They suffer because faith removes the usual supports that make life feel secure. The individual cannot rely on public validation, rational justification, or moral superiority. Faith strips these away. This stripping is painful. It exposes the individual to misunderstanding. Others may see the believer as irrational, extreme, or unnecessary. The believer cannot fully explain themselves without betraying the inwardness of faith. This inability to explain produces isolation. Kierkegaard insists that this isolation is not optional. If faith could be explained publicly, it would no longer be faith. It would become doctrine or ideology. Authentic faith, therefore, carries the burden of being misunderstood. This burden is suffering. Kierkegaard also insists that suffering arises internally. Faith demands that the individual confront their own inadequacy. Christianity does not begin with moral confidence. It begins with the recognition of failure. The individual must face their inability to live up to the demands of faith. This confrontation is painful. The believer cannot rest in the belief that they are good, righteous, or spiritually advanced. Faith does not provide self-satisfaction. It produces humility, and humility wounds pride. Kierkegaard insists that this wound is necessary. Without it, faith collapses into self-deception. The individual would believe themselves to be faithful without ever having confronted the cost of faith. Suffering reveals whether commitment is real. This is why Kierkegaard insists that suffering is a test, not a test imposed by God, but a test that arises naturally when faith is lived authentically. The individual who expects faith to bring comfort has already misunderstood it. Christianity does not promise relief from anxiety, doubt, or struggle. It promises seriousness. This seriousness is heavy. It presses on the individual continuously. Faith does not allow the believer to forget themselves in distraction or certainty. It keeps the individual awake to the difficulty of existence. Kierkegaard insists that this wakefulness is painful. The believer becomes aware of tensions that others can ignore. They feel the weight of responsibility more sharply. They cannot dissolve their choices into habit or convention. Every commitment matters. This intensity produces suffering. But Kierkegaard insists that this suffering has meaning, not because it leads to reward, but because it reveals authenticity. Suffering shows that faith is not being used as an escape from existence. It shows that the individual is willing to exist without guarantees. Kierkegaard insists that any faith that does not involve suffering is suspect. It may be belief, morality, or comfort, but it is not authentic faith. This claim is unsettling. It forces us to reconsider what we expect from belief. If we seek reassurance, harmony, or peace above all else, Kierkegaard insists that we are not seeking faith at all. We are seeking shelter. Authentic faith does not provide shelter, it removes it, and it is here, in this exposure, that suffering becomes unavoidable. Kierkegaard sharpens his claim by insisting that suffering is not merely something that happens to the believer from the outside. It arises from the inner structure of faith itself. Authentic faith demands a way of existing that refuses the shortcuts by which most people reduce the weight of life. One of those shortcuts is certainty. Most people seek beliefs that settle questions, provide clarity, and reduce anxiety. Kierkegaard insists that Christianity does the opposite. It removes certainty rather than supplying it. Faith does not give the individual answers they can rely on safely. It binds them to a commitment that must be lived without reassurance. This lack of reassurance is painful. The believer cannot say, "I know I am right." They cannot rest in doctrine or proof. They must continue to commit without knowing whether their commitment will ever be vindicated. Faith does not calm doubt. It places the individual in a relationship with it. Kierkegaard insists that this relationship is exhausting. The individual must repeatedly choose faith without support. They cannot convert belief into habit or routine. Faith must be renewed inwardly again and again. This continual renewal requires effort, seriousness, and attention. This effort produces suffering. It drains the comfort that comes from passive belonging. The believer cannot simply drift along with the crowd. They must remain awake to their responsibility. Inwardness demands vigilance. Kierkegaard contrasts this vigilance with religious comfort. Comforting religion reassures the individual that everything is in order. It provides explanations, rituals, and moral confidence. Kierkegaard insists that such religion is not Christianity at all. It protects the individual from suffering by insulating them from responsibility. Authentic faith removes this insulation. The believer becomes exposed to uncertainty, to misunderstanding, and to self-doubt. They cannot appeal to external authority to settle their anxiety. They must live with it. This exposure produces a specific form of suffering, anxiety without escape. Kierkegaard distinguishes this anxiety from fear. Fear has an object, anxiety does not. Anxiety arises when the individual confronts the open-endedness of existence, the fact that they must choose without guarantees. Faith intensifies this anxiety. The believer does not escape anxiety by believing. They accept it as part of their commitment. Faith removes the hope that anxiety will one day disappear. It teaches the individual to live with it responsibly. This is deeply counterintuitive. We often assume that faith should resolve anxiety. Kierkegaard insists that faith deepens it, not because faith is cruel, but because it is honest. Existence itself is anxious. Faith refuses to lie about this. Kierkegaard also insists that suffering arises from silence. Authentic faith cannot be explained publicly without being distorted. The believer cannot fully justify themselves to others. They must carry their commitment inwardly, often without recognition or understanding. This silence isolates. Others may see the believer as unnecessary, extreme, or misguided. The believer cannot defend themselves without betraying the inwardness of faith. This produces loneliness. Kierkegaard insists that this loneliness is unavoidable. If faith could be translated into public language, it would become ideology. Authentic faith remains inward, and inwardness is solitary. This solitude produces suffering, not dramatic suffering, but quiet endurance. The believer must live without applause, without validation, and without confirmation. Faith does not promise recognition. Kierkegaard insists that this endurance reveals authenticity. The individual who persists without reward, reassurance, or recognition demonstrates that faith is not being used instrumentally. They are not believing for comfort, status, or certainty. They are believing because they have committed. This commitment is heavy. It does not make life easier, it makes it more demanding. Faith intensifies responsibility rather than relieving it. Kierkegaard insists that this intensification is the point. Christianity does not exist to make life bearable. It exists to make life serious. Suffering is the cost of that seriousness. Without suffering, faith would collapse into illusion. It would become something the individual uses rather than something they live under. Authentic faith reverses this relation. The believer does not possess faith. Faith possesses the believer, and that possession is painful, not because it destroys the individual, but because it refuses to let them escape the weight of existence. Kierkegaard now confronts a misunderstanding that often arises even among sincere believers. The idea that suffering is something faith eventually overcomes. He insists that this expectation misunderstands the relationship between faith and existence. Suffering is not a stage to be left behind. It is a condition that accompanies authentic faith throughout life. Faith does not culminate in peace. It culminates in endurance. This endurance is not heroic or dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, and often invisible. The believer does not conquer suffering. They learn to live within it without retreating into illusion. Kierkegaard insists that this form of endurance is misunderstood because we tend to equate spiritual maturity with emotional stability. We assume that deep faith should produce calm, coherence, and certainty. Kierkegaard insists that such calm is more often a sign of evasion than of depth. Authentic faith remains restless, not because it is unstable, but because it refuses false resolution. The believer does not smooth over contradictions. They do not close wounds prematurely. Faith keeps the individual exposed to the difficulty of existence. This exposure produces suffering precisely because it resists closure. Kierkegaard insists that many religious expressions exist to end suffering psychologically. They offer reassurance, explanations, and emotional relief. While these may ease distress, Kierkegaard insists that they often bypass the seriousness of faith. Faith is not therapy. It does not exist to restore emotional equilibrium. It exists to bind the individual to a demand that cannot be reduced to well-being. This demand makes life heavier. The believer becomes aware of responsibility in a way that cannot be delegated. They cannot hide behind doctrine, ritual, or community. Faith does not dissolve responsibility into collective belonging. It concentrates it in the individual. This concentration is painful. The individual feels the weight of their choices more sharply. They cannot excuse themselves by appealing to what everyone does or what is normal. Faith removes these defenses. Kierkegaard insists that this removal produces suffering because it exposes the individual to guilt without escape. Guilt here is not moral condemnation. It is awareness. The individual becomes aware of their inability to live fully in accordance with the demands of faith. They recognize the gap between commitment and execution. This recognition hurts. The believer cannot resolve this pain by lowering the demand. To do so would be to abandon faith. Nor can they resolve it by self-justification. Faith does not allow the believer to declare themselves righteous. Kierkegaard insists that this unresolved guilt is essential. It prevents faith from becoming arrogance. It ensures that belief remains humble. The believer does not stand above others. They stand under a demand they cannot fulfill perfectly. This standing is exhausting. The individual must live with the knowledge of their own inadequacy without surrendering commitment. Faith does not promise that one will become good. It demands that one remain serious. This seriousness isolates. The believer cannot easily share this burden. Others may misunderstand it as negativity, weakness, or excessive introspection. Kierkegaard insists that authentic faith will often appear unattractive from the outside. It lacks triumph. It does not display success. It does not advertise peace. It manifests as persistence under difficulty. This is why Kierkegaard insists that suffering distinguishes authentic faith from aesthetic or ethical substitutes. Aesthetic religion seeks feeling. Ethical religion seeks moral clarity. Authentic faith accepts neither as sufficient. It demands commitment without emotional reward and without moral certainty. This demand produces suffering because it removes the supports by which life is usually made manageable. Yet Kierkegaard insists that this suffering is not meaningless. It testifies to the seriousness of faith. It shows that the individual has not turned belief into comfort or identity. They remain under obligation rather than above it. Suffering in this sense is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that faith has not been falsified. This prepares Kierkegaard's next move. If suffering accompanies authentic faith, then attempts to eliminate suffering in the name of religion must be examined critically. Not all relief is faithfulness. Some forms of relief are forms of escape. Kierkegaard insists that the task is not to remove suffering, but to understand what kind of suffering reveals authenticity, and what kind merely disguises evasion. Kierkegaard now makes a crucial distinction. Not all suffering is evidence of authentic faith. Some forms of suffering arise precisely because faith has been distorted. The task is not to glorify suffering indiscriminately, but to discern what kind of suffering reveals seriousness, and what kind conceals evasion. This distinction matters. One can suffer intensely and still avoid faith. One can even suffer because one has turned faith into something it was never meant to be. Kierkegaard insists that authentic suffering does not arise from fanaticism, self-punishment, or moral exhibitionism. Authentic suffering is quiet. It does not seek recognition. It does not dramatize itself. It does not demand admiration. When suffering becomes a spectacle, it has already slipped into self-deception. Kierkegaard insists that faith does not require visible suffering. It requires inward seriousness. Suffering arises not because the individual seeks it, but because seriousness removes escape routes. The believer does not look for pain. They simply refuse to lie to themselves. This refusal is costly. It prevents the individual from smoothing over contradictions, from declaring premature peace, and from converting belief into self-assurance. Authentic faith does not allow the individual to congratulate themselves. Kierkegaard insists that this is where suffering often emerges. The believer must live without the emotional rewards that often accompany religious identity. They cannot rely on feeling good about their faith. Feelings fluctuate, faith does not. This produces a particular kind of suffering, dryness. The believer may experience faith without emotional confirmation. They may feel nothing at all. Kierkegaard insists that this absence is not failure. It is often a sign that faith has been stripped of aesthetic support. Aesthetic religion thrives on feeling. It seeks inspiration, uplift, and reassurance. Kierkegaard insists that this form of religion collapses the moment feeling fades. Authentic faith survives precisely when feeling disappears. This survival is painful. The believer must continue without emotional reinforcement. They must commit without inner reward. Faith becomes endurance rather than experience. Kierkegaard insists that this endurance is misunderstood. It is often interpreted as loss of faith, depression, or spiritual weakness. Kierkegaard insists that it may be the opposite. Faith that persists without consolation reveals seriousness. This seriousness is difficult to bear. The individual cannot point to emotional states as evidence of faith. They cannot reassure themselves through experience. They must remain committed inwardly without signs. Kierkegaard insists that this condition exposes the individual to despair, Not despair as loss of meaning, but despair as confrontation with one's inability to secure faith through effort or feeling. The individual discovers that faith cannot be produced at will. This discovery is humiliating. The believer must accept dependence without control. Faith is not something they generate. It is something they remain open to. This openness feels passive and vulnerable. Kierkegaard insists that this vulnerability is essential. It prevents faith from becoming achievement. The individual cannot take credit for belief. They cannot claim superiority. Faith remains a relation rather than a possession. This relation is asymmetrical. The individual is always the weaker party. They remain exposed to doubt, dryness, and uncertainty. Authentic faith does not promise protection from these conditions. This is why Kierkegaard insists that suffering accompanies faith, not because God demands pain, but because faith strips away illusions of control. The believer must live without guarantees, not only intellectually, but emotionally. They cannot rely on feelings to secure their commitment. This absence of security produces suffering, but Kierkegaard insists that this suffering has integrity. It reveals that the individual has not turned faith into an emotional crutch or moral badge. They are not using belief to stabilize their identity. They remain under obligation rather than above it. This is why Kierkegaard insists that authentic suffering must be distinguished from self-inflicted misery. Faith does not demand self-harm, deprivation, or martyrdom. It demands honesty. Suffering arises when honesty is maintained without consolation. This prepares the final movement of Kierkegaard's account. If suffering accompanies authentic faith, then faith must be understood not as victory over existence, but as persistence within it. The question is no longer how suffering can be eliminated, but how one can exist faithfully without fleeing from it. Kierkegaard's final claim about suffering and authentic faith is perhaps the most difficult to accept. Suffering is not something faith explains, justifies, or redeems. It is something faith endures without evasion. Christianity does not solve the problem of suffering. It refuses to lie about it. This refusal is decisive. Many religious accounts attempt to give suffering meaning by turning it into a lesson, a test, or a path to reward. Kierkegaard insists that this impulse often functions as escape. It converts suffering into something manageable, something that can be understood and therefore controlled. Authentic faith resists this conversion. The believer does not explain suffering away. They do not treat it as a transaction or a sign of spiritual progress. They accept that suffering remains opaque, something that cannot be fully accounted for without falsifying existence. This acceptance is painful. The individual must live without answers that would make suffering bearable. Faith does not promise that suffering will make sense. It promises only that one can remain committed without sense-making. Kierkegaard insists that this is the highest seriousness. To endure suffering without justification is not resignation. It is refusal to escape into illusion. The believer does not pretend that everything happens for a reason. They accept that existence exceeds explanation. This acceptance deepens responsibility. The believer cannot outsource meaning to narratives that explain suffering away. They must live responsibly within suffering rather than above it. Faith does not lift the individual out of existence. It binds them more tightly to it. This binding produces loneliness. Others may seek explanations, comfort, or optimism. The believer must often remain silent, not because they have answers, but because they refuse to provide false ones. This silence can appear cold or pessimistic. Kierkegaard insists that it is honest. Authentic faith does not offer consolation on demand. It does not soothe pain by denying its depth. It remains present without explanation. This presence is demanding. The believer must resist the temptation to flee into distraction, certainty, or ideology. Suffering exposes the limits of all three. Faith refuses to cover those limits over. This refusal explains why Kierkegaard insists that authentic faith is rare. Most people seek relief before they seek truth. They want belief to make life easier. Kierkegaard insists that faith makes life more serious. This seriousness does not glorify suffering. It recognizes it. The believer does not seek pain. They simply refuse to deny it. Faith does not make suffering meaningful. It makes evasion impossible. This impossibility defines authenticity. The individual who lives authentically does not explain away the contradictions of existence. They remain exposed to them. Faith does not reconcile the individual to the world. It keeps them awake within it. Kierkegaard insists that this wakefulness is costly. It prevents complacency. It prevents self-deception. It prevents the individual from mistaking comfort for truth. Suffering remains as a reminder that existence cannot be mastered. This reminder is not despair. It is seriousness. The believer continues to live, act, and commit without guarantees. Faith does not eliminate risk. It intensifies it by refusing illusions of safety. Kierkegaard insists that this intensity is the mark of authenticity. The individual does not claim victory over suffering. They do not claim to understand it. They claim only to remain faithful without escape. This is why Kierkegaard insists that suffering belongs to faith, not as punishment, not as proof, not as reward, but as the condition under which faith remains honest. If suffering disappears entirely, faith has become comfort. If suffering is explained away, faith has become ideology. Authentic faith exists only where suffering is endured without falsification. Kierkegaard leaves us here, without consolation and without resolution. Faith does not heal existence. It demands that we live within it truthfully. And for Kierkegaard, that truthfulness, however painful, is the highest form of faith.